Good morning, and welcome to a surprise bonus Remember the Film episode ish thing where we are hearing Hugo's thoughts about the new Uncharted movie from Sony. Uh, the movie released in Europe earlier this weekend. And
It's not even. Hang on, sorry. I don't even think it's Europe because I know it is releasing in Italy next week, the same release as the
oh,
US. I think
okay.
it just came out in the UK on the 11th for some reason.
Tom
I'm not
Holland
sure
pulling
why.
strings, getting it out in
Maybe
England
could
a
be.
little early.
Yeah,
But yeah, so that's what we're
that could be
discussing.
a reason.
We are going to discuss Uncharted, spoiler free entirely, because as we just established, it hasn't released in the rest of the world yet. But we're going to dive in with a little bit of questions for Hugo. Kick it off with a very simple question. Hugo, what did you think of the Uncharted movie?
I thought it was a really good time. I went to see it in IMAX. It looked pretty good. It was fun. Like it was a fun, light-hearted action story. Very much in the vein of the Uncharted stories. Like I think they um, kind of managed to represent that kind of story very well on screen. I don't know how much someone who isn't into the Uncharted games would get out of this because I mean it is a very by the numbers simple adventure story. We have to follow a map and find clues and discover little secrets. So it's not there's nothing innovative about it. There's nothing particularly you know smart or different about it, but it's fun, and I think for especially for fans of the games, it'll be a fun little movie to watch. Definitely worth a watch if you're a fan of the game, I think.
But it is a genre that is very accessible,
Yeah,
and the kind of thing that most people probably aren't expecting an extremely deep
yeah,
story
yeah, yeah,
to.
yeah.
So in that regard, you think it kind of it hits the mark?
I think so. I think I've seen a lot of reviews being quite harsh on it, but I don't know. I think it's okay to have good 7 out of 10 movies sometimes that are just meant to be fun and not trying to be anything special. Um, I don't know. I think sometimes reviewers can be a bit too harsh with these movies that that aren't. I think a lot of the time movie critics kind of fall into this thing. Oh, if you're doing something that isn't innovative, then you're just using IP to make a fun movie. But I don't think there's anything wrong with using IP to make a fun movie, and I think the movie is fun, which is what it has to be. Um, compared to the video games, I'm personally more of a fan of Uncharted 4, just because I think by Uncharted 4 you have more of a relationship to these characters and you can give them more emotional depth. And I think the movie falls more into the Uncharted 1 to 3 range, where it's kind of more of a self-contained story
At a
and
little more surface level.
a little more surface level, but like it's fun, and I had a really good time. I was smiling the whole way through. There were fun moments where they play with things from the games, little Easter eggs, or like even the way they put the camera. Sometimes it's kind of like
Like the over the
it
shoulder
yeah, they're,
kind of
they're they're
view.
doing some not necessarily over the shoulder, but they're doing some cheeky things that you if you've played the game, you're like, oh yeah, they do that in the game, and that was fun. I don't know, you know how sometimes a movie is just pretty good but not amazing, and
Yeah,
people say, oh, it's terrible, it's the worst thing that ever happened, and
yeah, that happens with a
it's
lot of
not. It's
movies.
fine.
I can think of a
Yeah,
few Star Wars movies where that
yeah, absolutely.
that's
Yeah,
been
I
the
completely
case.
agree. Where a lot of movies are like, this is good. I mean, it doesn't have to be the best movie of all time every time. It's good. I had fun.
So you are a fan of the Uncharted franchise, correct?
Yes, I've played all of them. Well, I haven't didn't play the Vita one, but I
Okay.
have played all the other ones.
So I didn't beat the Vita one, and
Yep.
I haven't finished Uncharted 4 either, but I did play
Oh my
I did play
God.
1 through 3. Uh,
You have to play Uncharted 4 on PS5 now.
I
It
was
looks
playing it
insanely
with
good.
my old roommate. Like we were like,
Mm.
every time we died, we'd trade off,
As a controller, oh, that's the best way to play Uncharted.
unfortunately, he moved out before we finished it. So
Oh,
so then I was like, oh, he'll come back and we'll play it, and it hasn't happened. But so I should just go back and finish it. Regardless,
yeah.
I'm a fan of the franchise as well, and I know that there's some questions that a lot of people are really anxious about. So I'll ask the first
Mhm.
one that a friend of mine who happens to be in our chat right now asks: Is Tom Holland too young to be Nathan Drake? after having seen this
No,
movie.
I don't think so at all. Like it's a first adventure. He's older than the flashbacks in Uncharted 3 and he's younger than Uncharted 1. So it's kind of like the first time he went on an adventure with Sully. And
Yeah,
I think it kind of fit, like I think it's interesting. The movie does this thing where it's not canon, like it's not the same canon because some things are kind of,
it can't be right
but
because we see in the flashbacks he's much younger when he first meets Sully than he is in this movie.
yes, it's true. But it's kind of could be like it's not exactly because we have seen when he meets Sully, and that's the only thing that the movie actually breaks canon. So it's definitely another story, but it kind of could fit. Like it kind of would make sense, like in another version of this story, that he would meet Sully maybe when he was in his 20s,
Yeah.
early 20s. Like that, I didn't have a problem with the age at all.
Okay. What about Mark Wahlberg as Sully? That was when it was announced that he was cast, and then in every time
Yeah.
they've released images or trailers or anything leading up to this movie, probably about 75% of the comments are Mark Wahlberg can't play Sully. So I have to ask, how did Mark Wahlberg do in the role of Sully?
So it is one of the elements I think of the movie that works the least. I think that the things that work the least about the movie are like the opening like 5 minutes does a little bit of a clunky backstory to the character, and they kind of speed run through stuff that if you've played the game you would understand about Nate, but that kind of it's a little jarring. I think the dialogue is a little wonky because they go, ah, yes, mum did like it's kind of whatever. But and then Mark Wahlberg, I think, is the other element that doesn't fully work. I think he's pretty good. Like I think him and Tom Holland together on screen are have an energy to them and it does work. They kind of work well together. If you're looking for accuracy, like he represents well the character of Sully, I think it just doesn't he's basically playing a character that's more similar to an older Nathan Drake, and they kind of him and Nathan in the movie have very similar energies. So it's there you don't have that contrast in the same way that you do in the games, but
I
it
suppose if they progress and like Mark Wahlberg continues to play Sully and
yeah.
Tom Holland continues to play Nathan Drake, like if this movie is a success and they want to make
Mhm.
more of them, as they both get older,
Yeah.
it'll kind of make sense that they have some similar characteristics because people often take on some of the characteristics of their friends, especially
Mhm.
people that they spend a lot of time with.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
So I mean, I think that's something I could grow to
Like
adjust to.
for me, it didn't. I don't really care when something is adapted. I'm not very much a stickler for things being as accurate as possible
Right, you don't want
to
a
the
one
source
to
material.
one.
Like yeah, if it's different, it's different. Like it has the spirit of Uncharted, and in many ways, I think it nails it. So I'm not necessarily too bothered with things that aren't the same. But the way in which it didn't completely work for me is that they were a bit too similar. You know how sometimes even Marvel movies run into this kind of thing where everyone's sense of humor is too similar to each other,
Hmm.
especially when you've had scenes like there were moments where Doctor Strange was on the screen with Tony Stark, and like you want a bit more of a contrast between characters, I think. And in this, they kind of seemed a little too similar in that sense, so
Okay.
it didn't always work. But again, it's still fun. Like I still think Mark Wahlberg is kind of a fun, weird personality, and there are moments where he works well as the character. But does it feel like that character from the video games? No, it doesn't.
Okay.
So
But that for you, that didn't take away from your ability to enjoy the movie.
no, I thought it was fine. Like I didn't think it was a big deal.
Okay.
Was my point of view, I guess.
So you said that he has kind of a similar energy to Nate.
Hmm.
Does that mean that he doesn't have the right mindset for Sully, or like did they
No,
completely change the character, or because like I
no,
think
no,
of
no.
Sully and I think of a guy who's like a bit of a smart ass, right?
Yeah.
But is also charming and
Hmm.
friendly and also kind of like crotchety in a way. Like
Hmm.
he's been through some stuff. Now I
Yeah,
assume that
yeah.
with
He's
Mark
a little
Wahlberg,
grumpy,
yeah, with him
right?
being a little younger though, I would
Yeah,
expect him to be a little less grumpy than.
yeah. and I think there's something to be said about Mark Wahlberg just looking young. Like he's not that young.
I
I don't know
know.
how old Mark Wahlberg is, but compared to Tom Holland, I think that the age gap is pretty accurate to what it is in the games, right? More or
Yeah,
less.
I would think so.
Like it must be like 20 something years between them. So it does. It's not that. But he does. Mark Wahlberg is quite. He seems younger than he is. So I guess you don't really have that contrast. But he does have the general characteristic of Sully. Like he loves his gold. He doesnn't really care if he screws somebody over. But at the same time, he's not like somebody who just kills people easy. I mean, in the games are a little different, but he's not like a villain necessarily, but he's also not necessarily a great guy. Um, but he does have kind of a heart of gold underneath and a soft spot for Nathan. So I mean, the general characteristics of the character are there.
Okay.
It's just not
Mark
not
Wahlberg is
exactly
50 years old right now.
exactly.
So
And
when this
Tom
movie
Holland
was
is my
filmed,
age. Yeah,
when this movie was filmed, is because it was filmed like
a few years
almost like
ago,
3 years
I
ago
guess.
now,
Yeah,
right? So he would have been
yeah,
47,
yeah. And Tom Holland
which
would have been 23.
which
You know.
coincidentally is about the right age
Yeah,
for Sully when he first met
yeah.
Nate in the games.
Yeah,
So you know,
more or less, you're there. You know,
and
it's
in
whatever.
fact, I think that this works out okay in that, like in the games, there's moments where you're like, there's no way this 65-year-old man
Yeah,
should be
it's
doing the
doing
things he's,
parkour.
yeah, doing parkour, like straight up parkour, climbing up cliffs.
Yeah,
So like, we suspend our disbelief on that a little bit, but
yeah,
I can picture Mark Wahlberg, who takes incredible care of his,
yeah,
body. I can picture him doing
yeah,
parkour into
yeah.
his 60s if they do make this into a franchise.
Oh, sure, yeah. I could see, I could totally see it. Also, like another standout for me was Sophia Ali. I'm not sure if the pronunciation is correct, but she plays Chloe from the
Chloe,
games.
right?
Yeah, and her and Tom Holland, I think, are the best performances in the game. In the game, in the movie. Another thing that didn't quite work for me was the villains, but like the villain plot was kind of whatever. But I feel the same way as most of the villain plots in the Uncharted games in the first place, so I didn't
They
really
are
mind.
among the weaker aspects of the games.
Like, yeah, it's more about how they interact with the main characters, and like the main characters kind of there's always tension between Nate and Chloe, there's tension between Nate and Elaine, and there's tension sometimes even between Nate and Sully. And I think and of course Sam in Uncharted 4, but I think those interactions are always more interesting than the actual villain. And it is the same in this movie. Like I think the relationship between him and Sophia Ali is fun in the film. Yeah.
I think with the villains, you want in the Uncharted games, it's more about their energy
Yeah.
and the spirit that they bring to the scenes they're in. So Antonio Banderas plays
Mhm.
the villain in
Yeah.
this, correct?
Yes.
Uh, uh, so we already said that you weren't like completely thrilled with the motivations, and
No, I mean it's it's fine. It's an Uncharted villain. So he's like, oh, there's the secret treasure, and I think it belongs to me. So I'm gonna pay a bunch of paramilitary people to find it for me, and I'm gonna constantly be kind of close to where Nathan is, but also Nathan is kind of always a little bit of a step ahead. But then I catch up. That's the dynamic that
yeah,
you have in
which
Uncharted
is
games,
how
and
it is in the Uncharted games too. Yeah,
yeah,
so
and I think it's completely serviceable. It's not amazing, but Antonio Banderas is always very charismatic. So
yeah.
even
Well,
when he doesn't have that much to work with, I think he's a fun presence on screen for sure.
and I would think you wouldn't want to have your villain in an Uncharted movie be too menacing off
Yeah,
the bat, because like that's not what they're about. They're supposed to be quasi realistic with a
yeah,
supernatural flair
hmm
to in one way or another, right?
yeah,
So if you make him too like crazy madman, then
mm.
then I don't think it would work, especially in a movie format. Already in the games, they get a little like it's like, oh, okay,
Yeah.
you
They
are
go a little.
insane.
Yeah, they go a little over the top. But I mean, and it is the reason why four is my favorite because it is the more grounded of the four games, and it kind of works best for me, and also because it kind of explores the characters and their emotions Sorry, and their relationships a bit more than the other games for me. Um, but yeah, I think the villain is okay. Like it doesn't add much to the movie, but it doesn't detract from it
Right.
uh, a whole lot. So I think it's fine. Like the most fun part of Uncharted for me, at least, is putting together the puzzle of finding these ancient, puzzles in churches and going underground in crypts and like
So that was
putting
the
all
next
the
thing I was
story
going to
together.
ask.
Okay.
Is the mystery of this movie solvable by the viewer?
Well, I mean, it kind of follows the very much the video game formula. So it's not like it's constantly, you need to find this, you find this clue, and then it gets you to this place, and you think the treasure is going to be here, or what they're looking for is going to
But it's
be
actually
here,
another
but
puzzle.
then it's another puzzle, and then you find a map, and then like it's it's fun. It's Indiana Jones,
Okay.
which I think the most fun part. Like you can't necessarily figure it out before they do, but it's fun to see them go through these very weird, impossible things that some pirate hundreds of years ago has left behind. Like I always find it very entertaining.
So I did want to ask for some like comparison. You've obviously you mentioned Indiana Jones,
Hmm.
uh, and I also wanted to bring in National Treasure as
Right.
another. Have you seen
Is National
National
Treasure the
Treasure?
one with Nick Cage?
Correct. Yes.
Right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I
So
remember those. Is that the one where he steals the
he steals the
Constitution?
Constitution. Yes.
Yeah.
Or Declaration of
Or the
Independence.
Declaration of
Declaration of
Independence. Yeah, yeah,
Independence.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But and then he's with the president that knows that movie's crazy. I remember. I
So
remember
yeah,
that it's
there's
crazy.
two National Treasure movies. One of
Yeah.
them is the one where he's like kidnaps the president for a little
Yeah.
while. Uh,
Yeah.
so I personally I love
They
the
should have
National
got
Treasure
Nick
movies.
Cage. They should have got Nick Cage to do Sully. That would have been
Honestly, he
great.
probably would have been good at it.
Yeah.
Uh, I'm holding out hope for Mark Wahlberg. But so comparing to Indiana Jones and National Treasure, um, like is this on the level of Indiana Jones
No. Like I mean, story wise, it's a simple story, and Indiana Jones mostly are
or
pretty
simple
simple
stories? Yeah.
stories. But the filmmaking is just not like Steven Spielberg, especially
Okay.
in there's a level of filmmaking in those movies and just cinema. How do you want to say it? Just there's just a cinematic quality to those films that this
So
doesn't
it
have.
doesn't quite reach that.
Like yeah, no.
So this is if I could make sort of a guess, I'm gonna guess it's sort of like an MCU level of cinematic quality versus a
Yeah.
okay.
It's more of a modern blockbuster where sometimes you're like, oh yeah, this could have been a bit more artful in the way that they're doing this action sequence, and they could
Do you
have.
wish that it was?
Um, I don't know. Define artful. It might be the wrong word, but there's a sort of an analog feel to action sequences in Indiana Jones that
Because they
just
were in fact like
because they were
actually being done.
doing they were doing the things that you're seeing, and I think it just adds a level of I hate that word, but grittiness and realism to the film. That this is more of a sort of glossy modern blockbuster, but especially I would say especially in the third act it gets a little nuts, which is something that might be expected, but it until then there is also some good stunt work that they do some action sequences that are smaller, like kind of more contained. um there's moments of good tension where the classic thing Indiana Jones, there's spikes coming down from the ceiling and he has to figure out how to get out of this room. that
Right.
that type of that type of thing they do quite well. um then the big third act thing is kind of dumb, but it is what it
So
is.
the next thing I wanted to ask about was the stunt work. Uh,
Right.
we already talked about how Nathan Drake in the games and Sully for that matter and
Yeah.
Chloe for that matter all do some incredibly physically taxing
Hmm.
things. Uh, do we get that sort of
It. I
content in
mean,
this movie?
obviously not to the same impossible degrees of the game. Like he's not Spider-Man, whereas
Okay.
in the games he's kind of climbing up cliffs like it's nothing.
Right.
But you do get some parkour. You do get some cool action moments where he does things that he would do in the games. So I think that stuff works. It's not, I mean, it's not as extreme, but like it, you know how Nathan Drake is kind of he's extremely competent, but he has moments where he's kind of bumbling around,
Yes.
where he
Like
gets hit in the head and he has to like figure out how to get to deal with a guy that is much larger than him, which is also a staple of Indiana Jones.
yes.
And that, there's things like that in this movie that do work, where he has to be clever rather than the strongest character, and I think that stuff works.
So I'm very excited for this movie. Like we did
Hmm.
our episode about our most anticipated movies, and I didn't put this on my list.
Yeah,
Uh, and but it just honestly, it just narrowly didn't make my top three
right.
because if this movie is good
Hmm.
and it has the potential to become a franchise, I would love that because
Right.
I love this genre. Indiana
Yeah.
Jones, National Treasure. I love the they're a great blend of action and detective, right?
Yes.
And so
Like
that's
this,
that's what I'm
you
hoping
know,
for.
it it's there's something great about a movie that it's about finding a secret treasure in an exotic location, and
Yeah,
you fly around the world and see cool shit. Like they don't. It's not a genre that has as much traction as I think as it once had, and
like
it's always fun to see one when one is pretty good.
honestly, I even look at a movie like Aquaman, and the
Yeah,
the parts of that movie
yeah,
that I liked best were all the we got to go
yeah, yeah,
to
yeah.
this place and solve this puzzle to grab this thing, and they do
Mhm.
that a couple of times in
The
Aquaman, and those were the best parts of that movie.
the Bond movies kind of scratch that itch a little bit, but they're more kind of
There's a little more
spy
subtlety,
work
I
and
think, with
yeah.
the Bond movies. But yeah, so like it's that sort of thing, and
Mhm.
this movie does deliver on that.
I think so. I think yeah, the locations are pretty cool, and they kind of fit the type of place that you would want to see in an Uncharted game. So yeah, I thought that was the best part, honestly. Looking for clues in exotic locations and seeing the mystery and going to these cool places. That was the most fun part.
You and I talk with some regularity about the harshness with which people approach IP based movies.
Yes.
Um, does this movie do a good enough job that it will quell some of the naysayers going in, or do we just think that
Mm.
the internet is too far gone?
I can never look. If I'm being completely honest, I can never. I'm in this weird limbo where I cannot understand super fans of things, and at the same time, I cannot understand super detractors of things. Where I don't get people who, anything Marvel ever does is the best thing ever, and I don't get people who everything Marvel ever does is terrible because it's IP and it's destroying cinema. Like I'm always very much in the middle where, some of these movies are fucking great. Some of these, sorry for the swear word, but some of these movies are great. Some of these movies are fine, and that's fine. Some of these movies maybe are not so great, but I'm never as extreme on one side or the other. So I never know what to expect with this because I think it's pretty good. I think if you're a fan of the game, it engages with what the games are in fun ways um, that will put a smile on your face. I was smiling. There's some little there's one Easter egg specifically that I will not spoil. That I was like, aha! I laughed in the theater, and like the people next to me who probably didn't know the games looked at me like I was insane. But for me, it was like, oh, that's so cool that they thought of doing this. So I think fans of the games should enjoy this. They shouldn't expect to get like a 9 out of 10 best action movie. Like it's fine. It's a solid 6.5, 7 out of 10 movie, and that's okay.
And
Um,
so on that's for Hugo's scale. If you're familiar with how I rate things on Letterbox, it's probably going to be 7.5 or 8 for me.
yeah, yeah, I could
So
see it. Yeah. Yes, and that's fine. I think, people, but I am scared of people just, oh, this, Sully isn't exactly the same, so this is terrible. Like, I am worried that some people would go that route, and I already see the critics saying,
yeah,
"Oh, this is just like regurgitated story and IP," and you know, it is and
but
it
that's
isn't. Like,
critics. That those are movie critics.
Yeah,
And
and I think I'm always in the middle between critics and fans. I don't really agree with consensus fan opinions, and I often don't really agree with consensus critic opinions on these type of movies. So I'm never sure what the
I'm kind of
reaction
in the
is
same boat. I
going
kind
to
of
be.
always like find myself in that middle ground
Yeah,
where it's like I appreciate that critics are being critical, and
yeah.
sometimes that means that they detract
Like I
for
see their
things that are
points.
much that are they detract more than it will actually detract from my
Exactly. Yeah.
enjoyment.
That's
Uh,
that's the way I feel too, because I see those points, because it is we're taking one of the most famous video game IPs and doing kind of an Indiana Jones ripoff. True, but also there's no Indiana Jones happening. There's no
I
movies
mean,
like Indiana
I mean,
Jones
there is an
happening.
Indiana Jones happening,
Yeah, but
but
not
it's
with
not the Indiana Jones that we are used to and
exactly.
expect.
It's not a genre that happens with frequency. And it is, unfortunately, in the times that we live in, very rare that you can just do, oh, we're just doing an original adventure IP that has this type of budget. Like, unfortunately, it doesn't happen. And this is the next best thing, is taking Uncharted and putting it on screen. And is it amazing? No, but it's fun. And I think that's good enough for what this is trying to be.
So I have two more questions for you, Hugo.
Okay.
One, uh, would you say that if you are a fan of the games, if you approach it with the expectation that it's not going to be a one-to-one transition, will that add to your enjoyment? Yes or no?
I think so, yes. I think there is more for somebody who knows the games than for somebody who doesn't. Like, unless you're a big fan of this genre, I don't think this is a must watch for anyone. If you just like action, like if you really like action movies, you really like like treasure hunting type stories, then I think you will enjoy this regardless. But it's not like something that you can't miss. But for fans of the video games, I think this is a really fun interpretation.
And so my second question is, do you think that this is good enough to start an Uncharted movie franchise?
Is it good enough? I think so. Yeah. Um, it'll depend on what um, the reception is, I suppose. If makes money at the box office, if fans actually like it, because it might. There is, as I said, there is a world in which all the gamers get really enraged and hate this movie, and so it just gets buried in negativity. In which case, maybe not. But you know, I think I don't. Okay, the movie was filmed a few years ago, and I'm not sure at what might have changed, what Tom Holland's relationship to this movie, to this character is, how much he cares. But I think the movie isn't not setting up a sequel. Like, it's not necessarily directly setting up sequels, but it's like it's leaving. Oh, it ends in a point where you could absolutely do sequels
Well, I
to
mean,
it.
like
So
look at Indiana Jones, look at National
yeah,
Treasure. Like we've already talked about those two franchises. They didn't end with a sequel
exactly.
setup in
No, no,
mind.
yeah. Which, yeah, it kind of follows that line more so than like a lot of modern blockbusters kind of directly tease what might happen next. This one maybe doesn't, but it follows that same logic of the Indiana Jones, or even James Bond for the most part, except for Daniel Craig movies, maybe, where it it ends and it's a self-contained story, but it would make complete sense to tell more self-contained stories with these
And I think
characters.
I like that. Uh, in the same way that the games don't really set
Yeah,
up the sequel in each game, because I like the idea that Nathan Drake has these adventures. Like
yeah, he has a
he
bunch
doesn't
of
he
adventures.
doesn't have an overarching adventure necessarily. I mean, obviously four has some ties
Yeah,
to things from the past, but it's not in those games. It's stuff you learned about in four.
yeah, yeah,
It's not
yeah, for
stuff
the
that you
most
learned
part,
about.
yeah.
It's like from games 1 through 3 for the most part. And so I like that self-contained nature. I think that does lend itself to movies very well. And
Yeah,
I think I'm kind of excited that they didn't directly tease a sequel, because that way if they never make another one, they made this one and you can enjoy it fully. Whereas
yeah,
like imagine if Dune didn't get the
yeah.
sequel greenlit after the way it ended.
That would be depressing,
Yeah,
yeah,
that would be
yeah,
so sad, right? So
yeah, yeah. yeah,
Okay.
I think it can work as a springboard for doing more of these, or it can work as a standalone movie that was fun and that kind of exists on its own.
Did you have any other things that you wanted to touch on in our little discussion here, Hugo?
Um, no, I think I touched all my points. I hope people are willing to accept an okay, decent movie and not get either overly enthusiastic or overly critical about it for the wrong. I mean, in my opinion, the wrong reasons. Like I think it's okay for movies to be good and fun
Yeah.
and not the best movie I'm gonna see all year. Like it
Okay.
was fun. It was a good time.
Well, so I guess that'll do it for us here today. I'm excited to see Uncharted. My intention is to see it next weekend when it releases. And I'll share with you my thoughts on that, Hugo.
Yep.
But for anyone who is watching now or watching the video on demand or on YouTube later, where can people find you?
People can find me at on Letterboxd at Hugo_Pinay, and you can find me at no wait, sorry, you can
Twitter.
find me on
Twitter is
Twitter
Hugo.
at
Yeah.
Hugo_Pinay, and you can find me at Hugo Pinay on Letterboxd.
Well, great. And you can find me on Twitter, Twitch, Letterboxd. Basically, just search Good Game Grizz on any platform, and that's probably going to be me. Uh, uh, so please, yeah, follow, subscribe, all those wonderful things. We really appreciate that. We will be back on tomorrow with our episode discussing The Lighthouse, Robert Eggers' The Lighthouse, which is, we're discussing, of course, because of one of my most anticipated movies of the year, The Northman, that is also directed by Robert Eggers. Hugo and I have already had some discussion of this, and so I know that this episode is going to be very interesting because we have very different outlooks, apparently, despite both having generally positive, opinions. So please come back, join us for that, and we will see you next time.
Bye.